This is Heretic. Heretic is a 1994 first-person shooter video game developed by Raven Software using the Doom engine. It released in December 1994, 2 months after Doom 2, a game largely regarded these days as one of the greatest video games ever made. So, it is kind of easy to lose track of these things in all of the noise. Heretic went on to be, let's be generous and call it a franchise, with the subsequent games Hexen, Hexen 2, and Heretic 2 inventing a plot to continue then resolve. In this game, you are playing a character called Corvus in the pursuit of a villainous serpent rider called Desparrel. These details will become less important as the game goes on. As a game, it's a classic 90s boom shooter. It's from a period just after Doom had defined the standards, and Doom as an origin point's a pretty strong place to work from. If you look at the weapons in Heretic, you'll see that they all have a very strong, let's say, homage element to the weapons available in Doom. Of particular note is the structure of the guns use the same number layout, that you have a weak melee weapon in first position, a equally weak and less likely to be used weapon in the second position, third gives you your first meaningful heavy hit, fourth is a rapid fire hit scan weapon, fifth position is kind of a heavy explosive attack, six is a rapid firing projectile weapon, and seven is a big fancy gun that's meant to be extra special and you will therefore never bloody use it. An element of the game that it gets to build on from this Doom structure, though, is the introduction of a whole bunch of extra elements that feel like the kind of things Doom could have had, but no one bothered to do them. Doom is, at its core, a very slick, tight, honed design, very much the kind of thing that John Carmack likes to make, where everything in the game is part of one simple system iterated on endlessly. Heretic introduced an item system, and items let the game introduce a variety of different power-ups that you can use on your own time, saving them up through the course of the level to distribute at different points. So it wasn't as simple as a radiation suit is here, I must use it and then get in the radiation that is immediately present, or I am wasting this effect. Instead, you would get items that sometimes let you do things like teleport back to the start of the level, or light up an area, but this specific area. In this, you also introduced the Tome of Power, which gets to do all sorts of fun stuff with the weapons. Specifically, each weapon gets an upgraded version that kind of looks a lot more like Doom stuff that you're really fond of. The shotgun becomes a super shotgun. The little pew-pew pistol becomes a rapid-fire version of the shotgun. The gauntlets of power that you use as a replacement for a chainsaw become life-draining weapons. The whole game has these bursts of activity where you try and optimize the use of the Tome of Power. Something's too hard, you've got a Tome of Power saved up, use that, blast through it. It's a really fun mechanic to use, because at its core, Doom is a game where you are given a limited number of resources and then expected to navigate through a challenge using as few of those resources as possible. In Heretic, by giving you this item system that you can carry around with you and use on your own discretion, it's allowing you to change the pace for different kinds of experience. If you're dealing with a really big, hard room, you might want to pop a Tome of Power and blast through it, or you might want to use a Shadow Orb and try and stealth past it. These are different levels of control. In Doom, the invulnerability sphere does much of this, but invulnerability makes it so you don't die when enemies attack you. Tome of Power is much, much more fun, because what it means is your attacks are now way scarier. You don't necessarily have invulnerability to back you up, but you can do a lot more damage, and that feels a lot more proactive as a way of resolving extremely hard choke points. Of course, knowing that the game gets more fun when you can do this is the kind of thing you sort of need to learn by playing Doom, and that's the thing about this game that's so interesting to me. Raven Software are effectively id's kid brother. It's not quite that kind of business relationship, and I don't mean any disrespect by this, but for every one of the engines that id Software put out, Raven licensed it early and made another game as follow-up that just took whatever the other game was and breathed a life into it that the original didn't have. Doom and Quake and Wolfenstein are very sleek experiences. the term programmers might use is close to the metal. There's very little in any of those games that is not necessary for everything in the game to work. You don't get set pieces, you don't get unique monsters, and you don't tend to get unique weapon interactions. It's all very use these 5 components and use them well kind of design. And that's great, and obviously Doom and Doom 2 have been able to use those tools for a variety of really fun, really interesting game design. But Raven Software's design aesthetic is willing to make exceptions. It's willing to make set pieces and specific triggers and unique models that are going to get used once, because all the work of the engine seems to have already been done. It's interesting, though, that while normally Heretic and the games like it worked by breathing something into these games, by adding something, there's something missing from Heretic that you might not notice until you've played it a lot and gone back to Doom. In first-person shooters at the time, there is this idea known as the hit scan weapon. Effectively, a hit scan weapon means you fire it and it immediately hits the end point of what it could hit. This was the mechanic used to represent bullets coming out of guns in Wolfenstein, and it more or less worked thereafter. There was no projectile in flight to avoid because it was just a bullet, and you don't dodge bullets after they're fired. This mechanic carried over to Doom for a whole range of different monsters that are using guns, which would be things like the shotgunner, the chain gunner, the pistoler, and inexplicably the Spider Mastermind, because apparently the Lords of Hell needed Richard Gatling to die before they could get on to making the really impressive stuff. In Doom as well, you get to run around with a couple of weapons that are also hit scanned, like the shotgun, the pistol, and the chain gun. Doom also involves a bunch of weapons that are pretty high variance. Shotgunners can do a very modest amount of damage in a glancing hit, or they can do a ton. This makes them an excellent mob to dot in amongst other mobs, because while you are dealing with meat shields or damage sponges around them, sometimes a single shotgunner can do half of your health with just 2 lucky hits. You know you're dealing with really good Doom players when a monster closet opens and they immediately start trying to focus down shotgunners instead of like Barons of Hell. There's another thing that Doom has, which is in its hardest difficulty, Nightmare. Monsters come back from the dead because at the time the difficulty was designed, there was a genuine position that we don't know if anyone can finish this, so why bother balancing it? In Heretic, the only person who has access to hit scan weapons is you. All enemies you encounter in Heretic are either going to melee you, and they melee quite hard, or they are going to throw an object at you. The nature of the engine they were working with is one where when an enemy decides it's going to hit you, they check if they're in range. When they determine they're in range, they start an animation, and that animation reflects them trying to hurt you. This attack then takes an animation. So things will initiate an attack, and if you, fast-moving, fast-reacting, absolute hero you are, step back out of range or move around them, that attack fires off and does nothing. The same thing's true of projectile flingers. If a monster flings a projectile that does damage when it hits you, if you avoid that projectile, you don't take damage. The result of this is that high-level difficulty on Heretic starts to look a bit like Toho, with all these projectiles flying around, but when you survive difficult rooms by just not getting hit, you feel like you are the prettiest Toho. Yep, that's right, I'm telling you now, Corvus from Heretic, he's a Toho. That's a lie, I know there aren't any boys in Toho. You might recognize this particular mix of hit-scan weapons and enemy projectiles, creating a high-impact, action-dodging kind of game in Destiny, which takes the same ideas and expands on it. Heretic expanded the gameplay experience of Doom by making Doom easier. Not that Heretic is easy. Heretic is designed by people who liked playing these games and liked losing these games. So, turning up the difficulty, even though it gives you double ammo on every pickup, still quite scary. All of that is to say what Heretic does as game design, but that's not the only thing that has been breathed into Heretic by these people at Raven. There's also a world, and lore, and narrative, and it wouldn't be hard to do more of that than exists in Doom. They actually don't, though. As much as I loved Heretic's aesthetic growing up, there isn't actually a lot of plot. Heretic 2 tries to backfill plot extensively, but ultimately the story in Heretic holds to John Carmack's principles. A long time ago in The Masters of Doom, John Carmack was quoted as saying, "Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." Now, first things first, he's just wrong, because game is an enormously expansive word that includes millions of different things, all of which require story or make story. And also, I guess that tells you a lot about what John Carmack thinks of and wants in his porn. Gus Von Sant, American auteur, all-round queer cinema clever clogs, and director of Good Will Hunting and Milk, if you need any kind of qualifications there, has touched briefly on video games and story. He created, as part of his Death trilogy, a movie called Jerry, which is famous for being long and dull and featuring mostly scenes of two characters trudging through the desert in a very real but also extremely dull way. At the time, there was a general question of why this movie got made the way it did. Von Sant eventually explained that he got the idea for the way Jerry worked upon watching, of all things, the video game Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider you may know as a game with runny, jumpy, climby, shooty, and is exciting and interesting and features a whole bunch of sequences where characters shoot things. But the crucial detail that he pointed out is that in a video game, all of the transition, all of the travel is done by the player. There is no cut like you would have in a movie. There is no clear, distinct snap, we're on to the next thing. And that creates a different kind of story. A story that he wasn't seeing made in cinema. Cinema is about cuts. Cinema is about skipping bits. And that means that the narrative presented by a game like Heretic or Doom is a narrative where you are engaging with the experience of the story happening through as much of it as possible. You may see some commonality with this idea and Valve's position on trying to take control away from the player in as few ways as possible to tell them a story from a first-person perspective. These are interesting questions about what you can do with a first-person shooter, but that's what you could do. What did they do? In the narrative of Heretic, if you read the lore, you would know that Disparal came to your dimension, because there are multiple dimensions, took it over with magic. And there were certain people, the she-elves, who were immune to this magic. So, Disparal, now in charge of everything, declared the she-elves to be heretics and tried to have them all killed. And maybe that succeeded. The text isn't clear. And what remained is you, Corvus, the last of the she-elves, who is here, branded a heretic, and is looking for either revenge or justice or freedom. It's not entirely clear. What can we tell about Corvus playing this game? It's not a particularly expressive game. We can tell that Corvus is probably physically quite strong, because there are a large number of weapons that Corvus carries around, and he can also beat someone to death with a stick. Not that sticks are necessarily the least lethal thing in the world, but it's not most people's normal default action when they want to kill someone. Also, everyone he kills explodes, so there's a lot of violence pent up in this. Speaking of pent up violence, Corvus laughs every time he picks up a new weapon. The character of the Doom guy and the Wolfenstein BJ Blazkowicz both had some positive reaction to getting access to a particularly impressive weapon or surviving something extreme. We don't get to see Corvus's face, animated and wiggling down the bottom of the screen, so instead we have to make do with what we hear. It appears that he has inherited from them the same general positive attitude towards devices of violence, which paints the image that this is a character who likes doing violence. Now, with all of that outlined, that's pretty much what you've got. Corvus is the last of his kind, maybe, seeking justice, maybe, and is doing it through the absolute distribution of ridiculous and excessive violence on as many different evil things as he can possibly find. Definitely. This is not a complicated narrative. They're right. But for me, part of why I loved Heretic so much growing up was that absence of detail. It was because I could imagine the kind of character Corvus was. In fact, at the time I didn't even know he had a name. I imagined him as my heretic guy. And I'm sure I gave him embarrassing names in my head, and I'm sure he had a sort of, this is my OC, do not steal, even though he was being created by a system everyone who played this game got to play around with. When Hexen came along and imposed more flavor and more lore on the world, which I am incredibly grateful for, we got to see more of the way that this world was affected by these things known as the Serpent Riders, of whom one rides a serpent, one is a serpent, and one definitely doesn't ride anything. I'm not saying that Half-Life necessarily is the proper way to do a first-person shooter. Boom shooters from the 90s are still enormous amounts of fun. Going back and replaying this game to make this video was a reminder of how much I loved these games, and how rusty I'd become in handling their particular difficulty spikes. But going back and replaying and re-experiencing it reminded me of just how much I loved the idea of this world and the texture it gave me. This notion of a sword and sorcery environment that still nonetheless was able to turn its magical devices into things that were as approachable and as handleable as the all-purpose death pointer that is a gun. There's a certain mage punkiness to the idea of a wizard whose every expression of wizardiness looks a lot like shooting people in the face. Heretic is a word that I'm very attached to personally. See, in actual religion, heretic means someone capable of making a choice. And in religions where destiny and election are important ideas, it's dangerous to be able to wield that power of choice, to be able to reject a god who is demanding you obey. I always find something very powerful in that, where a social system is set up that tells you, God demands this, and you have in yourself the power to say no.